Welcome, everybody, to another masterclass here at A Mind for All Seasons. I'm excited to share with you some dietary strategies to improve cognitive and mental health. And this comes from a presentation that I recently did for a large group of dietitians around the country. And it really gave me an opportunity to dig into some of the more recent research about diet and how it affects the way that the brain functions. Now, some of you have heard Randy Vaudry, our medical director here at Mind for All Seasons, talk about a 17-year-old young man that came into his clinic in Pocatello, Idaho, a few years ago with his father. And unfortunately, this young man had attempted suicide multiple times. He'd been to a lot of different doctors. He had tried a lot of different medications. Nothing was really working for him. And somebody there locally said, "Hey, Randy's the brain guy. You better go see Randy." So they showed up at his clinic and he did an extensive intake. He spent almost an hour sitting down with this young man and his father, really talking through his situation. And toward the end of the interview, Randy said, "What do you eat on a regular basis? We got to talk about your diet." And the young man looked at him and looked at his dad, looked at him, and he said, "Well, I eat Pop-Tarts and mac and cheese and ramen noodles." Randy looked at his dad, and his dad kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, it's a little bit of a point of contention at our house, but we quit fighting the fight a while ago, and he has his own shelf in the pantry, and that's basically what's on it." And Randy looked at the young man and said, "Well, when you're not eating Pop-Tarts and mac and cheese and ramen noodles, what do you eat?" And he said, "Well, occasionally a Big Mac." But that was basically it. And as Randy tells it, he just kind of pushed his chair back and he said, "I think this will be easier than I thought." And the young man looked at him like he was crazy, thinking, "It's probably not a good thing that I eat that. I'm pretty sure that's not good." Randy said, "Look, I'm not going to do anything with your medications or try anything else until you can come back and say that you have eaten one piece of something that is real, whole, raw, in the form that you find it in nature once a day. That's all I ask. Just for 2 or 3 weeks, eat real food once a day." Well, he did that. He was grumbling about it, I think, but this young man did it. And a couple of weeks later, he was at a counseling appointment, and his counselor said, "Something is different. What has changed?" And the young man said, "Oh, this crazy doctor in Idaho, this crazy doctor here in town told me that I needed to change what I was eating. And so I've been going to the grocery store on my lunch break, going to the produce section, and just picking something out." And much to her credit, the counselor looked at him and said, "I think it's making a difference. I think you should do that at every meal." Well, long story short, this young man, within 6 months, was off all of his mental health medications. He was symptom free. He was back playing high school sports. And sometime later, I think it was over a year later, Randy and his wife were at a high school volleyball game and they felt someone come up behind them. And then a leg sort of came between them, and this young man squished his way down between them, put his arms around them, and turned to Randy's wife and said, "I love your husband. He saved my life because he taught me how to eat." Now, that type of scenario is something that reminds us that diet and what we're putting in our bodies really does affect how the system operates. But it also begs the question, is that a one-off situation? I would never argue that every single mental health challenge could be solved with diet alone. But I do think that that case illustrates a broader question, and it's one that researchers have looked at. So consider this article, for example, where researchers were asking, is there an association between diet and depression in children and adolescents? And they were doing a review of the literature. Or consider this article from 2022 in the journal Nutrients, looking at ultra-processed food consumption and mental health. And they were doing a meta-analysis of these observational studies. So this isn't a clinical trial where you're trying one diet against another. It's observational. So they're looking at what it is that people eat and what are the general outcomes from that. So there are some limitations to observational research, but you do start to see some trends and things that you could potentially even later test if it were ethical to do that. And in this article, they found conclusions that suggest bidirectional associations between the intake of ultra-processed food and adverse mental health. In other words, if you are eating ultra-processed food, it's more likely that you'll have adverse mental health. And if you have adverse mental health, it's more common that you're eating a lot of ultra-processed food. And then these meta-analyses looked in part at cross-sectional studies that modeled ultra-processed food consumption as the exposure variable and symptoms of the common mental health disorders. And those types of meta-analyses demonstrated direct associations. So depression and anxiety symptoms were common in people that were eating processed food. So we might say that food equals mood. And if we're eating really good food, it's more likely that our mood might fare better. Part of this is because the gut and the brain are connected. And I know you've probably all heard that. In fact, we talked about it here quite a bit at A Mind for All Seasons. Many people in the general public know that the gut and the brain are connected. But nearly 10 years ago, when I started A Mind for All Seasons, people still thought that was pseudoscience. This has rapidly changed, and more clinical evidence has just piled up showing that the gut and the brain are connected. So let's explore some of the ways that they're connected. Part of how we know about the gut-brain connection comes from the NIH Human Microbiome Project that ran from 2007 to 2016, and it looked at the 39 trillion microorganisms living in or on our bodies. That's a staggering number of microorganisms. So here are a few fun facts. The cells in the body contain 20,000 to 25,000 genes, but the microbiome likely has 100 to 500 times more. And genes are important, but the microbiome, it turns out, may influence our health as much or even more than our genetics. No two people have identical microbiomes, but we all have between 500 and 1,000 species of bacteria in the human body at any one time. And it's also interesting that 90% of our serotonin, and I've even seen reports that say more like 95% of our serotonin, is made in the gut. No wonder food and mood seem to go together. What we're eating heavily influences the microbiome, and all the microbes that are living in our system are performing a lot of symbiotic processes that are influencing how the rest of the human system functions. So let's consider a specific situation that affects a lot of people these days, leaky gut syndrome. Inside the gut, there's a thin layer of tissue where it's just one cell thick. And that tissue has to be a barrier to keep pathogens from getting into the rest of the body. And there are tight junctions between the cells in the gut that prevent this from happening. But if you look at this slide, you see the tight junctions labeled. There are those little 3 lines in between the cells. And then you see examples where the cells aren't so close together. They don't look so healthy, and those tight junctions are destroyed. There's a growing understanding of the kinds of things that are destroying those tight junctions. When they get destroyed, though, then food particles and microbes and pathogens can leak into the bloodstream. If you're leaking something like gluten into the bloodstream, it can't be processed there, and the body will make antibodies against it. And that seems to be associated with autoimmune kinds of problems. There are autoimmune diseases on the rise pretty much across the board. More and more people are having autoimmune symptoms than any time in my lifetime. It's remarkable to see the challenges that have come into people's lives as our food supply has changed. So, what is destroying these tight junctions? Well, there's a lot of different theories out there, and there's a lot of different research. Some of the more recent research shows that most of the artificial sweeteners out there likely destroy the tight junctions in the cells of the gut. So, if you're trying to lower your carb intake by drinking sugar-free soda that has all of those artificial sweeteners, that's not necessarily a good thing. And there's some evidence that you may be more likely to have serious health problems if you're drinking diet sodas. So it's probably better if we just cut the sodas out altogether. There are a lot of different signs of leaky gut. I'm not going to go into a ton of these, but if you have food sensitivities or mood issues, or irritable bowel syndrome, or other things that you see on this list, those are signs of a leaky gut. And especially if you have autoimmune disease, it's much more likely that your gut is leaky and that food particles and microbes and pathogens are leaking into the bloodstream and firing up the immune system. So, what about food choices in the context of leaky gut, or if you have autoimmunity? It's important to recognize that a lot of foods that generally would be considered healthful, they're real foods. You find them in nature. They're not some ultra processed concoction put together by a chemist. They're actual food. Sometimes it throws people off when they learn that some of those good foods might actually be bad for an individual. So, why is that? Well, there are a lot of different reasons, but I'll give you some examples. What you're looking at is a chart showing some cross-reactivity. Now, to break it down, you see here sort of these bead-like strings with a bunch of letters on them. They look like necklaces that are laid out. And those represent amino acids. Different tissues in the body and foods are made of amino acids. Those are the building blocks. And when you look at corn and soybean and spinach and tomato, you see these strings of amino acids that make them up. And smaller chunks of those strings are called peptides. Now, if you look at certain comparisons between corn, soybean, spinach, tomato, and human aquaporin 4, you find that there are certain tissues in the body that have strings of amino acids that actually are identical to some of those strings of amino acids in food. So let's say that you're eating a lot of corn. There's tons of stuff made with corn these days. So you're eating a lot of corn and you have a leaky gut, and corn particles are leaking into your bloodstream. Little microscopic particles get into the bloodstream, and they have these strings of amino acids that are squared out here. When that gets into the bloodstream and the immune system fires up against it, it's likely to look at human tissue that has some of those same strings of amino acids and say, wait a minute, we've seen you before. And then the immune system attacks the body. So sometimes people have leaky gut and they're leaking gluten into the bloodstream. Gluten has a string of amino acids that is identical to part of the amino acid strings that make up thyroid tissue. And there are other chunks that mimic some of the strings in cartilage tissue. So the idea here is some people get all fired up and develop autoimmune thyroid problems or rheumatoid arthritis that's exacerbated by things like gluten leaking into the bloodstream. Some people struggle with nightshades. So the nightshade family includes potatoes and tomatoes and eggplant and peppers. And these foods are high in lectins. Well, if you have leaky gut and you happen to be really sensitive to lectins and you're eating these foods, even though they're real foods, and they might be generally good for people, they might not be good for you. They might fire up your immune system. And you might end up with irritable bowel problems or GI issues, heartburn, nerve sensitization, or joint pain. So we've talked a little bit about mental health and food and how it's affecting us. What about neurodegenerative disease? This whole presentation is about both cognitive and mental health. Well, years ago, in 2017, Randy, our medical director, went to a conference with Dr. Dale Bredesen, who was the founding president of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging at UCLA. And at that conference, Dr. Bredesen shared this slide, and Randy took a picture of it. So credit goes to Dr. Bredesen, and he said the perfect Alzheimer's drug would have to do all of this stuff. And his whole point in sharing that was saying, you won't make a drug that does all that stuff. But many of those things are measurable, and we could think of them like holes in a roof. And if you patch one, that roof is still going to leak. What you would have to do is patch all the holes. Another way of thinking about it that I like is a ship. Because sometimes when our health isn't very good, we say, I feel like my ship is sinking. Well, if your ship looks like this one and you patch one hole, it is not going anywhere except down to the bottom of the ocean. And when it comes to our health, the same thing happens if we're not paying attention to all the holes. So let's build upon this knowledge a little bit, and then we'll circle around to, okay, what about diet? How does diet affect us when it comes to our cognitive health? We've talked before here about the fact that 50% of the cells in our brains are neurons. The other 50% by volume are immune cells. So different structures in the brain have different percentages. Some areas are thought to have 90% immune-related cells and only 10% neurons. But overall, by volume, it's about 50-50. Well, why is this important? When the immune system turns on, things change for you and for me. Think about what happens when we get sick with a nasty virus. One of the earliest symptoms for a lot of people is terrible fatigue. If you have a really bad virus, you might wake up one day and feel like, oh, I think I'm coming down with something. And so you crawl back in bed, and pretty soon you might be sleeping 20 hours a day and still feel completely exhausted. We've all observed something like that. Why is that? Well, it's a question that Dr. Robert Naviu really dug into. When the immune system turns on, energy production drops and we get brain dysfunction. Dr. Naviu is a mitochondrial researcher at UCSD, and he published a paper back in 2014 titled The Metabolic Features of the Cell Danger Response. Now, he's since written other papers about this idea of the cell danger response. The concept is that mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, are usually involved in just cranking out energy. But when something invades the body, when we have a pathogen, or when there's a cut and maybe bacteria and other germs are breaching the skin and they're getting into the body, then mitochondria also work as a sort of switch for the immune response, or they're related in mediating the immune response. And when there's a battle to be fought, mitochondria shift out of energy production and they shift into this more defensive posture. I like to think of it as like mitochondria are knights in the castle. And on the average day, they're doing a lot of work around the castle, just taking care of things. But as soon as there's an invading army on the horizon, then things change. And the knights drop whatever they're doing on a day-to-day basis and they go out and they fight the battle. And so stuff doesn't happen inside the castle. That's a little bit of what Dr. Naviu was talking about. So if inflammation goes up, energy production drops. Well, that has huge implications for how our brains function. If 50% of the cells in the brain by volume are immune cells, then it means that when the immune system in the brain turns on, energy production drops. And what does low energy look like in the frontal lobe? Well, poor reasoning, poor judgment, poor planning, emotional lability. You might be calm one minute and just terribly discouraged and crying your eyes out the next. You might go from calm to fighting mad at the drop of a hat. Sometimes people, when they have frontal lobe dysfunction, even engage in sexually inappropriate behavior. There are all sorts of things that come out when parts of the brain aren't working correctly. Low energy production in other areas relates to what those parts of the brain do. So you might say that the formula for improving brain health, and by brain health I mean both cognitive and mental health, is decrease immune activation and increase energy production to improve cognitive and mental health. Well, that means that we have to understand how we produce energy and what kinds of things activate the immune response in the brain. We've talked a little bit about cross-reactivity with food and the connection between the gut and the brain. If you have gut health problems, you likely have brain health problems, and some of that likely relates to activation of the immune system. It's been said that if you have a leaky gut, you just might also have a leaky blood-brain barrier, and it might be easier for pathogens to get upstairs and fire up the immune response. So let's talk a little bit about how cells produce energy and then keep tying it into what food does to play a role in all of this. I've shared with some of you before the analogy of steamships from the 1800s. And on those steamships, there was a coal-fired furnace. And you'd have a guy shoveling coal in to keep things going. And that guy needed three things to be able to do his job. He needed to stay hydrated because that is a hot, sweaty job. You have to feed him pretty regularly because he's burning a lot of calories. And you better have an exhaust system that works. You need to be able to clear exhaust out of the engine room or he'll drop dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. Basically, the cells in our bodies are like that engine room. We need well-hydrated cells for them to function right, and that includes fluid and electrolytes. So what we're drinking or not drinking matters, and that ties into our diet. You have to feed the cell. We've got to be able to get fuel in the cell. Well, if you're resistant to insulin and it's difficult to get glucose into the cell, you have a problem. You end up underfed and you can't produce as much energy as you need to. And when it comes to exhaust, well, just running the cellular engine produces a type of exhaust called reactive oxygen species. And it's antioxidants that help to clear that out. We need a healthy balance between antioxidants and reactive oxygen species. Or another way of putting it is reduction and oxidation have to be in balance or we get into trouble. So if there's a brain health problem, if there's an energy problem, even an energy problem throughout the body, we might ask ourselves, is it a hydration/electrolyte problem? Is it a fuel problem? Or is it an exhaust problem? Or some of two or all of those? This is the citric acid cycle. This is the process by which cells are producing energy. And it's complex, and we're not going to dig into the ins and outs of it, but if you look closely, you will see different vitamins, especially B vitamins, and you'll see magnesium and glutathione. And you might start asking, okay, what role are all these things playing? Well, you might say that B vitamins are brain food, and glutathione is what clears the exhaust out of the cellular engine. It's one of the most important antioxidants that we have. If you have low glutathione levels, it's really difficult to clear the exhaust and you won't produce as much energy. You won't get as good of results. So what happens when you pay attention to all of these different factors? What you're looking at is a CNS vital signs cognitive test for a 62-year-old man who was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. He was an engineer by training, and he was absolutely brilliant until he wasn't. He ended up losing his job because he couldn't remember things and he couldn't do basic math, and he wasn't able to perform on the job the way that he had for many years. And when he was forced into early retirement, his wife took him to different neurologists. The first one did a battery of tests and said, "I'm so sorry. You have early onset Alzheimer's disease. There's not much I can do for you." Well, that wasn't good enough, so they went to another neurologist who gave him the same diagnosis. And after a third neurologist diagnosed him with early onset Alzheimer's, he said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" According to him and his wife, the neurologist looked at them and said, "Well, I think you better get yourself a really good attorney because in the next few years you might not know who your wife is." Well, that's devastating. Fortunately, he had a family member that's aware of the work that we do at A Mind for All Seasons, and so he came to see us. And part of really looking deeply at the root cause issues that were causing his brain to not produce good energy, as part of that, we did a CNS vital signs cognitive test. And you'll see that his composite memory score was in the 8th percentile. This guy that was diagnosed earlier in life as a genius by a psychologist was not performing at genius levels anymore. Everything from the yellow area on down is less than the 25th percentile. Things were really declining for him. And yet, by paying attention to nutrients and hormones and metabolic health and inflammatory markers and how genetics were playing a role in things, look at what happens to him. He went from the 8th percentile to the 91st percentile. That's remarkable. And it happened in just a few months. An important part of that intervention and what made a difference was what he was eating, because this individual had a lot of insulin resistance. Sometimes people call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes, and it even comes out in the literature. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of that research here in a minute, but people had been talking about type 3 diabetes for quite some time. They'd been talking about the challenge for many Alzheimer's patients to get glucose into the cell to be converted into energy. And then this happened. Dr. Christopher Palmer is a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School. He's been practicing for over 25 years. He's also the director of education at McLean Hospital, arguably the world's premier mental health hospital. And he published a book a few years ago called Brain Energy, in which he theorizes that what all mental health conditions have in common is metabolic dysfunction. Now, metabolism in the minds of a lot of people means weight gain and weight loss. But metabolism really is, how do cells produce energy? And Dr. Palmer would contend that in all mental health situations, cells are not producing good energy in one way or another. Now, interestingly, he recognized that a lot of mental health medications are actually repurposed epilepsy drugs. There's a drug called Depakote, for example, that is often used as kind of a mood stabilizer. And it's used in other situations as well. But Depakote really is an epilepsy medication. And Dr. Palmer started wondering if a dietary intervention that was developed for epilepsy could make a difference in mental health situations. Well, I'm talking about a ketogenic diet, which was developed in 1924 because researchers realized that epileptics who were fasting generally didn't have seizures. And they didn't understand why. They just observed that if an epileptic was fasting, they didn't go into seizures. Well, you can't fast every day for the rest of your life. You'll run out of fat stores and you'll just die. But the hallmark of the fasted state is that insulin is down. When insulin goes up, the body knows it's been fed. When insulin is really low, it knows it's fasting. But if you eat fat, like if you eat a whole avocado, there's not an insulin response to that. Fat does not require insulin. It's metabolized differently. And so researchers clear back in 1924 decided, well, if people can't fast forever, maybe they could have a diet that mimics the fasting state. Maybe that would work. That's where the ketogenic diet even came from. Well, Dr. Palmer started using the ketogenic diet, since it's approved for epilepsy, in mental health patients to see what the outcomes would be, and they were remarkable. He found people with schizoaffective disorder and paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and anxiety and depression and all sorts of mental health diagnoses, some of which didn't have a good prognosis at all. And they had cessation of their symptoms. Large numbers of people that he worked with had major improvement when they used a dietary strategy like a ketogenic diet. Now, he talks in this book about the fact that not everybody has to eat a strict ketogenic diet. Some people just need to ditch ultra-processed food, focus on eating real food, and that's enough to correct metabolic health problems. But could it be that the real proliferation of mental health problems that we have in our day is driven heavily by the same kinds of root cause factors that are driving Alzheimer's disease and heart disease and the obesity epidemic and type 2 diabetes? These are all metabolic health problems. It's interesting to compare the list of symptoms of insulin resistance with symptoms of depression. There's actually a lot of crossover between the list of symptoms. And sometimes we worry more about what to call something than why we have that symptom in the first place. Maybe we'll get further if we just focus on the why, even before we worry about what to call it. Insulin resistance seems to be a driver of brain inflammation, and it leads to poor energy production and brain fog. We've seen that with clients here at Mind for All Seasons for many years. And part of this is because the brain is an energy hog. It's consuming about 20 to 30% of the calories that come into our body. So even if you're sitting at a desk just working away, your brain is using a ton of fuel. And if we're not getting that fuel into the cells to be converted into energy, we're going to have problems. We're going to feel hangry. But wait, there's more. If you're familiar with Ron Popeil and his infomercials, he always said, but wait, there's more. Well, there's a lot more that we could talk about. If you look at the National Center for Health Statistics and you search the number of deaths for leading causes of death, you find that at the top of the list is heart disease these days, and then cancer, accident, stroke, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and then Alzheimer's disease, and we keep on going down the list. A huge number of those, most of those things, are actually driven by the same root cause factors. There's a silent epidemic behind most of those diseases. So let's explore symptoms versus the root cause. There are all sorts of things that have labels that all come from the same root cause. So heart disease is a label, inflammation is a label, Alzheimer's disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, obesity, polycystic ovarian syndrome, fatty liver disease. If we keep on going through and we look at things like erectile dysfunction and all of this list of stuff, what does it all relate to? Those are all symptoms of insulin resistance. And when you have too much insulin in the body, a lot of bad things happen. Too much insulin, for example, reduces the ability to produce nitric oxide. It changes the signaling for that. And nitric oxide is one of the things that allows our blood vessels to dilate so that we can have really good blood flow. If you have high levels of insulin in the blood constantly, you tend to have really high blood pressure. And that's a real issue as it relates to heart disease and many of these other conditions. You don't want to have super high blood pressure throughout your body just damaging you. When you have a lot of insulin resistance, it's also difficult to deliver sugar into the cell to get converted into energy. And somewhere around 80% of Alzheimer's patients have insulin resistance in the brain. So let's consider a few basic things about insulin. Insulin is made in the pancreas, and everybody knows that it regulates glucose, but it has an effect on every single cell in the body. There's literally no cell in the body that does not have an insulin receptor. Insulin is involved in regulating how we use energy, how cells change size, and it regulates the production of other hormones. It involves itself in processes that determine whether we're living or dying. It's anabolic. That means it's the hormone of growth and storage. When insulin goes up, we tend to gain weight. In fact, if you go look at pictures, I should have gathered some of these pictures. If you look at pictures of type 1 diabetics back at the turn of the 20th century. So type 1 meaning they have an autoimmune disease, their pancreas isn't producing insulin anymore. If you look at them, they look like they were living in a concentration camp. Absolute skin and bones. And many of those children just wouldn't survive very long. They could eat all the sugar they wanted. Their bloodstream could be full of sugar, but they couldn't use it as fuel. And if you compared pictures of the same children before and after, once insulin became available as a medication to humans, those same children, within just a few weeks, plumped up beautifully because insulin's required to do that. So insulin resistance equals reduced responsiveness to insulin, and you might call that hyperinsulinemia, too much insulin in the blood. It's important to know that you can be insulin resistant for decades before becoming a type 2 diabetic. Type 2 diabetes is diagnosed as too much blood sugar. You go get a metabolic panel and your glucose is like 150 and the doctor says, oh my goodness, we got to look at this. But what happens long before, many years before most people would show up with high blood sugar is that insulin goes up. But fasting insulin is not checked as part of a standard checkup. That is beginning to change a little bit. I have a friend who's a primary care doctor, and just a few years ago, he went to a medical conference, and an endocrinologist, hormone specialist, kind of took them all to task. And he spent his entire presentation talking about how too much insulin in the blood is the root cause of all these different diseases, just like the tree picture that I showed you earlier. And this endocrinologist was saying to these primary care doctors, you need to be checking this in primary care. So my friend started doing that. And he came back to me and he said, Eric, there's a shocking number of people that have pretty good blood sugar levels, but their insulin is off the charts. I never knew it. And I was privately thinking, yeah, we've been checking that for years. I could have told you that. So, what about insulin resistance and Alzheimer's risk? What's the
Yeah.
association? Well, aside from APOE4, the genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease, aside from that, fasting insulin carries stronger statistical significance than your age or smoking or your stroke history. And the probability of that being related to chance is basically zero. The p-value, if you're familiar with statistics or if you were at our masterclass where we talked about how to read a research report, the p-value is 0.0004. It's basically impossible that this is accidental. That's pretty remarkable. And this comes from a study that was looking at 980 people ages 69 to 78. So insulin resistance is huge as a risk factor. Consider this research paper looking at risk factors for progression of brain atrophy and aging. They found that brain atrophy started with an A1C of 5.7, and some research would point to even lower than that. Well, that means before you're even a diabetic, your brain is shrinking. In other words, we got to keep our sugars lower than to not become diabetic. If our sugars run high enough that we're sort of at the top end and approaching type 2 diabetes, we're already getting into trouble. The only highly significant correlate of the rate of brain atrophy other than age was greater hemoglobin A1C, according to this particular paper that I was showing you. That's remarkable. So what does more current research conclude? If we look at a research paper from August of 2024, they were asking true or false, Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes, evidence from the bench to the bedside. They found insulin is essential for the modulation of cognitive processes, and disruption of this modulation will result in cognitive impairment. You have to have good insulin signaling for the brain to work right, in other words. This looked at ultra-processed food exposure and adverse health outcomes. And they found greater exposure to ultra-processed food was associated with higher risk of adverse health outcomes, especially cardiometabolic, common mental disorders, and mortality outcomes. In other words, you eat more processed food, you're going to have worse mental health, and you're more likely to die. What about this one from December 2022? Association between consumption of ultra-processed foods and cognitive decline. People that had ultra-processed food consumption above the first quartile showed a 28% faster rate of global cognitive decline and a 25% faster rate of executive function decline compared with those in the first quartile. So what do we do about all of this? Well, we have to eat brain food. We have to fuel ourselves for success. And Randy loves to joke that we need to eat the rainbow, but not this one and not this one that so many people are just filling their bodies with on a regular basis. This is the rainbow that we need to eat. We need to eat a wide diversity of different fibers because that is what the bacteria in our gut live on. It's not just that we're eating for ourselves, we're also eating for that massive microbiome that has so much to do in our bodies that it might be more impactful than our own genetics. So how do we sort through all the tribalism that's out there? I'll go through these quickly because some of you have heard these before, but I really still think that fasting is foundational to a good diet. We need to ask ourselves, when am I not going to eat? And a good rule of thumb is to have 12 hours from the time you eat your evening meal till you eat again the next day because the body needs a break. Now, some people can fast much longer. Many people benefit from a 24-hour fast once or twice a month. I do that at least once a month, often 3 or 4 times a month. Not everybody can do that. It doesn't work for every single human body. But when we're fasting, we're recycling a lot of cells. We're breaking things down and building them up again. When you're fasting, you're also releasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a growth factor for brain cells. So there's a lot of good that happens when we're fasting. And part of what allows a leaky gut to heal is giving it a rest so that it's not constantly just processing things. We need to eat real food. We need to recognize that food is fuel. I know food is wrapped up in our culture, in our practices, with all sorts of different things that we do as people. But fundamentally, food is fuel. And we might ask ourselves, what have I hired this fuel to do? We would never put diesel in a gasoline engine and expect it to run right. We just wreck the engine very quickly. When we go to the gas station and we grab something quick and easy and we throw it down our throat, it's probably getting us into real trouble. That's putting the wrong fuel in the system. And it doesn't wreck the engine immediately, but we pretty quickly start to have problems. So we need to choose our fuel based on our goals. Why am I eating this thing? Am I trying to provoke an insulin response because I've been working out and I need a recovery meal and I'm trying to build muscle and insulin is a hormone of growth? Or am I trying to lose weight? Is my fasting insulin level 35 and I'm trying to get it down somewhere less than 7? Well, we need to eat very differently in a situation like that. We need to control our sugars and avoid processed fake food. We need to realize that hormones drive both feeling hungry and feeling full. Just because you're feeling ravenously hungry, it doesn't mean that you have to eat. Some people think, oh, if I'm really hungry and I don't eat, I'm going to die. Well, not necessarily. If you were in a concentration camp and no one was giving you food, you could actually live for many days without food. Your body knows what to do in a situation like that. You could choose not to listen to that signal. I'm not suggesting that you should always ignore it, but we can make decisions that are driven by principles and goals, less so by just what we're feeling. If you're feeling hungry, but it's not time to eat yet, well, when I was growing up, I used to run in the house and ask my mom if I could have a cookie, and she'd say, no, you'll spoil your dinner. You got to wait till dinner. So I'd get a drink of water and go back out and play again. We've gotten away from that kind of approach as humans, and we could return to it because most humans have lived that way for virtually all of human existence. It's only the last few decades that we've thought that we need to have not only 3 meals a day, but snacks in between and just be constantly eating. Food timing also matters. So when we eat makes a difference. If you eat a good recovery meal within 30 to 60 minutes of a workout, it's very different than eating that same meal hours later. If we're eating really close to bedtime, different things happen than if we give our body a chance to process the food, and then we can rest really well because the gut's supposed to slow down at night anyway. We might also ask ourselves, what's our stuffing made from? That's a phrase that Randy likes to use in some of our master classes and training. We need to consider how cell membranes are put together. They're made of both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-6 fatty acids are more rigid. Think of a pen or a pencil. And omega-3s are more flexible, kind of like a drinking straw. Well, cell membranes need properties of both flexibility and rigidity. And we get into trouble if we have too much of one versus the other. I was looking at labs for some of our clients earlier today, and I saw one individual who had 20 times more omega-6 than omega-3 fatty acids. That means that cell membrane is 20 times more rigid than flexible. And omega-6 fatty acids are very pro-inflammatory. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. Well, if you're 20 to 1, it's like saying you're 20 times better at starting the fire than putting it out. That's a recipe for a constant fire, for chronic inflammation. Dr. Michael Lewis writes about this pretty extensively in his book, When Brains Collide. Some of you may have read it. If you haven't and you're interested in how omega-3s affect our brains, it's a really good source to turn to. It's written for the layperson. We talk a lot about the need to supplement omega-3 fatty acids because most of us don't eat a lot of fatty fish. And there are other master classes about the difference between an ethyl ester alcohol-based fish oil and a triglyceride-based fish oil. I'll sum it up by saying triglyceride-based fish oils are fish oil in their natural triglyceride form, and they're about 75% more absorbable than an ethyl ester alcohol-based fish oil. So these are just a few examples of fish oils that many people use to improve their omega-3 levels so that they're in more of an anti-inflammatory state and they're supporting the building blocks of brain cells, the building blocks of cell membranes. About 30% of the structure of a brain cell is DHA, which is one of those omega-3 fatty acids. So this becomes a really important intervention for long-term brain health. Now, what about toxic exposures from food? Everybody has heard that a lot of the food supply is sprayed with glyphosate, Roundup. The wheat supply, starting in the early 2000s, started getting sprayed with Roundup because it's a desiccant. It dries the wheat out so that it doesn't rot in the grain silos. And that seems to have had a really negative effect on the health of the country. And there's a lot of research being done to try to tease that out and figure out what role that might be playing. But there are other toxic exposures from food. Think mercury, for example. Several years ago, we had a gentleman come to a Mind for All Seasons with a tremor in his right hand. So it was called a Parkinsonism because it wasn't on both sides of his body. He couldn't make a fist. And he had gone from being happy and gregarious and really a fun individual who was highly successful in his business career to someone that was rude and abrasive and accusatory. He blamed others for everything that went wrong in his life. And he got so snappish and difficult to be around that his wife of decades divorced him and his adult children wouldn't even talk to him. He was totally depressed, even to the point of contemplating taking his own life. And when we worked through all the different factors that might be sinking the ship, one of the top things that we found was mercury toxicity. His mercury levels were shown here by this yellow line. And the CDC average is this little white line down here. He was in the 99th percentile for mercury. And as he detoxified from that and eliminated that mercury from his system, I watched the tremor go away. He could make a fist again. He could remember phone numbers again, long enough to dial them. His cognitive scores improved. But most impressively, I watched his personality change. He wasn't depressed and angry and accusatory anymore. He became pleasant and really joyful to be around again. It was a remarkable change. So where did the mercury come from? It came from his food. When he became really successful as a land developer, he decided, well, I got plenty of money, I can eat whatever I want. And most days it was ahi tuna sushi. Well, he also had some methylation challenges. He had a detox pathway that didn't work very well. And that mercury just built up over time until he got into real trouble. So that's one more example of how food could be causing a problem for us. Now, certain diets can be helpful tools. We've talked here before about ketogenic diets and autoimmune paleo diets, low carbohydrate, carnivore, low FODMAP diets are another option for some people, low oxalate diets or gluten-free or dairy-free. These are tools in the toolbox. Too many people fight over what diet is perfect for humans. And I think that's just really misguided from the get-go. I don't think there's one diet that's perfect for all humans. We're different genetically. We're in different metabolic situations. We have different conditions. Somebody who has a problem like mast cell activation syndrome, where they're highly sensitive to histamines, probably shouldn't be eating avocados because that's a high histamine food, and it might light up their immune system. And when the immune system turns on, energy production drops. So that would mean avocados aren't exactly healthy for that person. We need to personalize this. We need to understand our bodies and how they work. And we need to make decisions both for the short term and for the long term. So speaking of long term, what are some things that we can hang our hat on? And then we'll wrap up and have some discussion here. I like how Dr. Robert Lustig put it. In his book, Metabolical, he says, feed the gut and protect the liver. Whatever we're doing dietarily, we've got to take care of the microbes in our gut, and we need to make sure that the liver continues to function correctly. So what's the biggest thing that Dr. Lustig points out that will wreck your liver? Too much fructose, because fructose is only processed in the liver. And our human diet, at least here in the westernized world, now includes very high levels of fructose. High fructose corn syrup and other sweeteners have made their way into all sorts of foods. It's often shocking what foods have high fructose corn syrup in them. When the body is given many times much more fructose than the liver was ever meant to process, the liver just starts packing on fat around it. It stores that extra fuel as fat around the liver. And when you get a fatty liver, it wrecks a lot of things downstream metabolically. We also need to prioritize protein because that's the building block of muscle. Muscle has a very high concentration of mitochondria. So without preserving muscle, we lose energy production. Muscle is often the difference between being able to get up out of a chair or off of the toilet or out of bed on your own versus needing to have professional assistance with something like that. Some of you may be familiar with Hal Cranmer. I'm going to end this by letting you listen to a presentation that's really just a movie trailer for a documentary that's being put together called What Hal is Doing. Hal is an assisted living operator in Arizona that I've known for some time, and he uses the kinds of methods that we're talking about in his communities. He's especially focused on food. So I want you to hear what he's doing if you're not familiar with this. I don't think I shared sound though, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to quickly reshare this so that you can hear this. All right, here's what Hal is doing. And then be thinking of questions or comments that you have. We'll take a few minutes for a Q&A here.
Tell me what you do.
I own 4 assisted living homes around Phoenix, Arizona, where I have at least 10 people in each one, and we do our best to make them as healthy as possible. This is something that's sustainable, that they can see a path to a better life. They don't have to spend the last decade of their life in a bed or a wheelchair or on a lot of medications that they can't move away from.
Julie, what town are we in right now?
Surprise, Arizona.
Even until 2 years ago, the American Diabetes Association said that diabetes is a chronic progressive disease. It's incurable. Once you have it, that's it. But it's because they never manage it correctly, right? And dementia is the same thing. They go, it's chronic and progressive, nothing we can do. But now we're arguing, yes, there's stuff we can do now, and Hal's proving that.
When I got here, I was on hospice, and I began to eat properly and sufficiently. And they cut out all my ice cream and all of my sugar. And I just kept getting better and better.
One of the exciting things about all this is that her cognitive test has really improved. We're plugging holes in the boat, so to speak, trying to figure out what we can do to improve her physiology and help her have better outcomes.
When somebody goes home and they came in on a walker or a wheelchair and all of a sudden they're walking, they're home, they're in their own apartment, they're taking care of themselves, what peace would you have for your family member?
It's just the greatest feeling in the world when you see someone improve their health when they didn't think there was anything they could do. When their family sees them and sees the difference in them, there's no greater feeling in the world that you're helping someone else out, especially when they didn't have hope and now they have hope.
Well, I love what Hal has been doing for years. I love what so many of you have been doing. I love the results that we see when people really prioritize looking upstream and looking for root causes of some of the health challenges that the world is up against these days. I'm confident that as we prioritize diet and other lifestyle factors and continue looking at root causes, that people in general will start having better and better results when it comes to their long-term health. So I'm excited to get to spend a few minutes doing some Q&A and talking about some of the observations or questions that you have through all of this. Let's open it up, and I'll pull open the chat here, see if there's anything here.